Hello, sweet grievers. Mandy here. Restorative grief is all about creating easy access to healing, no matter where or who you are. That's why I want you to remember that if you want grief support beyond a podcast, then perhaps it's time to consider a one on one coaching connection. You don't have to implement all these grief strategies alone. Use the link in the show notes to learn more at mandykpart.com/coaching or reach out to me on social media because I'm here for you, okay? Now let's get on to this week's episode. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 132, titled, Okay, So They're Disappointed. Today, my friends, we are branching a little off the beaten path with our usual conversations here at Restorative Grief. Over the last few months, I've worked with a number of clients and connected with friends on the topic of boundaries and how exploring the way we use boundaries can either help or hinder our healing process. And they always result in someone being disappointed, and I know that's really hard, but that's what we're going to talk about because I want to chat about how we can identify the type of boundaries we're most comfortable with and find a way to use them well for our benefit and others in our experience of grief and healing. Well, let's start with some honesty. Are you feeling disappointed in your life right now? Maybe it comes from any decisions, your grief experience, your relationships to others, or even yourself. Where is the disappointment centered? Take a moment and reflect on how disappointment has recently reared its head in the last few weeks for you. If you can think of multiple ways you've been disappointed, pick one way that feels relatively mild, like a 2 to 3 on the intensity scale. Disappointment arises when we have an expectation that remains unmet. As a griever, I feel like I can name hundreds of disappointments in the aftermath of losing my mom, my miscarriage, my job, and all other kinds of losses in the last 4 years alone. In many situations, we can anticipate disappointment too. Have you ever just thrown your hands in the air and walked away from a situation, disappointed and believing you cannot affect the outcome? We already know that grievers tend to shy away from rocking the boat by keeping our needs and opinions quiet. We don't want to disappoint or upset others with our own discomfort, so we pretend all is well. Maybe we have expectations of care from our circle of support that aren't met. Maybe we feel we personally could do more or better by our own grief and feel disappointed in our lack. Framing disappointments as an unmet expectation is a nice way to say that someone violated our trust in one way or another. Violation of our trust in relationships is a broken boundary, and these broken boundaries can result in a secondary loss of security and relationship if we do not allow ourselves to get into the uncomfortable work of repair and reconnection. If you are someone who tends to avoid confrontation, you might be worried about where I'm going with this conversation, and that's okay, because again, a willingness to be a little uncomfortable means we're in a good position to expand our awareness and understanding. And that's a great characteristic for grief work. If you're anything like me, you've got a history of avoiding confrontations when you know it would generate disappointment in others. I know I might seem like a person who always speaks up when needed, but typically it's been on behalf of others. When it comes to my own safety, security, and belonging, my history of trauma and rejection just defaults to a behavior of staying guarded and hidden to remain connected, no matter how tenuous that connection may be. Want to know about my boundaries? Well, for years, they were extremely porous, allowing anyone or anything access to my heart and mind in order to hopefully create some kind of attunement. Have you ever said something like, "Ask me anything, I'm an open book"? That's a great example of a porous boundary. Because we want to belong, we act as though anyone can have Because we want to belong, we may act as though anyone can have access to us and that everyone deserves that access. The problem with this type of boundary is that it lacks reciprocity and opens us to being taken advantage of. Reciprocity in relationship is crucial for attunement to develop. When we are open and share, we do so hoping and expecting the other person to do the same. And when it doesn't happen, that unmet expectation leaves us disappointed, but we tend to let that violation of our boundary go unnoticed right away. It's when we finally notice that we've had porous boundaries that we can begin to grieve. This is where we start recognizing an imbalance in the relationships, the sense of feeling unknown or unseen, and realize that in trying to build connection, we violated our own values of being accepted and loved for who we are. Anyone? Anyone else hearing this and resonating? Because I know I'm not alone in experiencing this. I remember when I first realized I was operating with porous boundaries in relationships. It created an immediate influx of shame over the way I showed up for myself last and everyone else first. And recovering from this kind of people pleasing behavior takes time, but what it also takes is courage to let others feel disappointment. Because when we suddenly begin to express a healthier sense of self and a stronger, healthier boundary, we are rocking the boat. We start to push back in the relationships where we've not received that sense of reciprocity, and the people who've benefited from our porous, people-pleasing boundaries get their chance to experience their own disappointment. Honestly, I will never forget the way one former spiritual leader in my life spoke to me after I declined my volunteer hours any further. In retrospect, the response was fully revealing of them and the way they benefited from my desire to belong. But at the time, all I experienced was hurt and rejection and disappointment that I decided to push back. When I pulled out of helping, the response was along the lines of, "Gosh, that's too bad because the Lord showed me that you are positioned for great blessing and growth within this space, but that it's not something you can receive outside of the covering of this house. See, our team supports one another and you're choosing to leave." Holy spiritual abuse, Batman. Can you see, can you hear where this person let their own disappointment activate their nervous system into a sympathetic state and choose fight? Their response was not about me. But when a person is so familiar with their power dynamic with you and used to having access to people in a vulnerable state, then losing access to that person and their contributions can be a big loss, or in this case, can feel like a threat. On the other side of porous boundaries, before we settle in healthy boundaries, are rigid boundaries. Unmet expectations, such as mine in the scenario above, can lead us into a short-term need for rigid boundaries, simply for the purpose of safety and healing. In the situation above, my decision to pull back was affirmed by their response to me. And rather than remain in the community, I opted to leave altogether, although it was a slower process than I'd hoped. Why? Because my desire to avoid disappointment was such a human response to trauma and loss that I wanted to avoid as much of it as I could. I'd already experienced so much loss, and I didn't want to embody that even more. So I secretly hoped that they would notice how wrong their response was and apologize and open an avenue to maintain connection and possibly heal. But it was 100% healthier for me to pull away completely. But in my own fear of more grief, I didn't understand how to do that without experiencing the disappointment of their judgment and condemnation. And indeed, the attitude toward me continued after leaving, which also reinforced my choice as the best choice for me at the time. Still, those rigid boundaries were really painful, hard to navigate, and beyond difficult to implement. This is because in the short term, rigid boundaries help us create safety where we need it to survive. But long term, unchecked rigid boundaries are harmful. That is the direction that I went before I understood what I was doing. Now, why do you think rigid boundaries long term could be harmful? The coping strategies we use in short term, if never set aside, prevent us from healing. Coping strategies like quick, rigid boundaries and removing ourselves from a situation are meant for survival and management of what hurts or harms us in the moment, and to get us into a place of safety so that we can open back up, create a wider window of tolerance, and explore ourselves and our grief with curiosity, openness, and opportunity. But when we have that safety, the majority of us are rigid around whether or not we will return to our pain and face it with that compassion and curiosity. Sometimes we're just too afraid to approach ourselves in that way, but more often than not, it's because we've never been shown how to approach ourselves. And why would we? Our culture says it's much easier to keep calm and carry on as if nothing traumatic has ever happened. Denying ourselves a chance to face our pain is a form of rigid boundary that has transitioned from a coping strategy for safety into a permanent fixture for safety. It is also a function of long-standing white supremacy. And I bring this up because I want us to understand how this way of being became preferred by our culture and also how we can partner together to dismantle it. Before you stop listening, let me quickly define what I mean by white supremacy. It's not about race. Historically, it was commonly acceptable for Eurocentric nations to introduce their cultural way of life into indigenous cultures, often violently, as preferred and more, quote, civilized. For the sake of self, Eurocentric nations eliminated practices that did not align with their preferred outcomes for the people they were influencing. Those goals and tactics typically included power, profit, and political control at whatever cost necessary. As grievers, we cannot hope to heal in a way that aligns with our own values if we cannot understand how this principle of supremacy has controlled our grief process throughout history. Being an individual who prioritizes collective wholeness of our community means that recognizing the collective might need something that costs more than the collective is willing to pay for. In this case, consider that as a white middle-class American woman, I want paid bereavement leave for more than 3 days, and I want it guaranteed, and I want it funded by the government at the national level for all occupants of this nation. And in my perfect world, that means anyone, regardless of their immigration status, age, marital status, anything. Unfortunately, my viewpoint stands staunchly against the white supremacist nature of my culture, which states the best way to continue as a nation is to compartmentalize, pretend we're not hurting, and find a way to look okay enough to return to productivity, work, and making money within 3 days. And that's not even guaranteed. That's only if your employer says go for it. Even though I can demonstrate with evidence how collective wholeness would be much healthier long-term with paid bereavement leave for all, my approach costs the, quote, powers that be far more than they're willing to pay. Our nation, despite being a democracy, often cowers to the political and financial lobbyists who do not care if you are healed or happy at work. Choosing to break away from the rigid internal boundaries that keep you appearing okay in a culture like ours is a deep disappointment to the people who directly benefit from your porous external boundaries. It's wild how we can demonstrate both in a single moment, but it's true. Our internally rigid boundaries against our own needs, combined with our porous people-pleasing boundaries on the outside, just so we can belong, create a perfect storm where our grief work and our stories are the ongoing losses. When you decide to start practicing healthy boundaries, you will hit up against cultural norms like supremacy. You will experience rejection, loss of relationship, and lack of safety in places you once enjoyed. But do you know what else you will experience? A rush of acceptance for yourself. You'll begin to notice a return of that wilderness in your spirit that allows you to sense when you need to laugh, cry, run, jump, and you'll start giving yourself the freedom to lean into those precious moments of expression and healing. Understand that as much as grief work is personal, it is also and always political. You can bet your bottom dollar that pushing into your inner world and looking for realignment with your true self will disappoint people who like the controlled, quiet, and seemingly peaceful version of you. Some of them will even go so far as to say, wow, I'm not angry with you. I'm just really surprised and disappointed. Okay, so they're disappointed. Odd that someone who proclaims to love and support you might be disappointed in the uncovering of your true healing self, but here we are. The question is, are you disappointed in your healing? Or are you possibly and finally the one person you are no longer willing to disappoint? Thank you for listening to episode 132 of Restorative Grief. I meant it when I said we were veering off the beaten path today, and I hope you're feeling inspired and prepared to practice disappointment in your own life. I don't mean practicing by remaining disappointed in yourself and your own life story. It's not a helpful place to remain. But when we talk a big game about healing and grief work, we have to back it up with the willingness to follow where our internal parts are leading. And that can ruffle some feathers, to say the least. But the power of our honest expression is unmatched by any power play or control someone else can put on our lives. And that, my friends, that is worth all the disappointment and boat rocking you create. If this is your first time listening to the show, I want to thank you for listening through the whole thing. This conversation is not an easy one to start with, so kudos to you for starting out boldly. Be sure to subscribe to the show and keep yourself close as you listen through each episode. Listening just to say you listened doesn't serve your long-term healing regulation work. So lean in. You can learn more about restorative grief coaching and Patreon offerings in the show notes. And as always, one last thing before we go. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.